In today's note, we're going to be looking at the quadratic formula. And what the quadratic formula is for, it is for finding the solutions to a quadratic function. And basically what this means, x-intercepts. So we've kind of used, or we've found the x-intercepts before, but what we were looking for then, we were looking for the, we were using the x puzzle or the product and sum to help us find the x-intercepts. So this works even when you can't factor, which is a key thing. So it works even when you can't factor. So there may be some questions where you couldn't find the product or sum, or if you had trouble doing that, you can use the quadratic formula to basically help you get those answers. So the quadratic formula we see here, x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all divided by 2a. And a and b and c, what those are, well, a and b are coefficients on x squared and x respectively, and c is the constant. And so where are we getting these a, b, and c from? Well, they're getting them from when the quadratic function is in standard form. And again, standard form is ax squared plus bx plus c. So we'll go back and kind of highlight all those key things. So a we see is the first value. It's with the x squared, and a we can see in the formula here. For the next one, for b, we can see b in the formula here. The b is on the coefficient with x, and we can see that again here. And then finally, the c value is the constant, and we can see that here. So one other thing that may be new, that you may not have seen in formulas before, is the plus minus symbol. So the plus minus symbol, what that means basically is that you have to do both. So you have to add to get your first solution, and you have to subtract to get your second solution. It does sound like a lot, but when we go through the examples, you'll see it's not too much extra work. And that is because that you may have two x-intercepts, or we know that in some cases you can have two x-intercepts for a quadratic function or a parabola. So over here, we're just going to put this equation into words. So x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So again, if you have trouble reading this equation, you can look at this one, at it in words and kind of piece it together. So let's try an example. The first step, we want to set it equal to 0. So I need to move this 3 over for this equation, 4x squared minus x equals 3. So when I move it over, I get 4x squared minus x minus 3 equals 0. And now I need to find my a, b, and c. Again, remember standard form is ax squared plus bx plus c. So in this case, the a is with the x squared, so a has to be 4, b has to be negative 1, and c has to be negative 3. Again, I'll go back and highlight things. So again, c is that constant, so that number on its own. We have b with the x, so we don't see anything here in our equation, but we see a negative, so that means it has to be a negative 1. And then lastly, our a is with the x squared, so a has to be 4. So once we have all of that, what we can do now is we can plug this into our equation and simplify. So we have x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, all divided by 2a. When I plug this in, I get negative 1 plus or minus the square root of negative 1 squared minus 4 times negative 3, all divided by 2 times 4. If I bring this up and continue to simplify, I should get x equals 1, and the negatives cancel out, plus or minus the square root of 1 minus 40, or minus negative 48. I don't include that negative in the bracket in with the multiplication, so I have to subtract whatever number I get. A little bit nicer. All divided by 8. And I can take this one step further and simplify it to 1 plus or minus the square root of 49, all divided by 8. So what I can do now is I can break it off into my two parts, right? So this is where I have to do the plus and minus. And the reason we're doing it now instead of way back in the beginning is because either way we would still get to the same part. So it's really, the plus minus really doesn't come into play until the end. So if I do 1, I have x equals 1 plus the square root of 49, all divided by 8, and I have x equals 1 minus the square root of 49 divided by 8. So I have x equals 1 plus 7 over 8, and then I have x equals 1 minus 7 over 8, which basically I have x equal to 1 and x equal to negative 6 over 8, or negative 3/4. So these two answers here, those are my my x-intercepts, or my final solutions. So let's go through another example. Again, we want to remember we have to set the equation equal to 0 first. So if I want to solve x squared plus 1 equals 2x using the quadratic formula, I need to bring this 2x over. So when I do that, I have x squared plus 1 minus 2x equals 0. Again, I need to find my a, b, and c values. Again, remember a is in front of the x squared. This is a little different because they're out of order, but b is in front of the x, and c is the constant on its own. So again, don't just assume that because it's the second number that's the b value. It's whatever's in front of the x, and c is the constant on its own. Once I have my a, b, and c, I can plug it into my formula. So I have x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all divided by 2a. Start plugging stuff in. So negative 2 plus or minus the square root of negative 2 squared minus 4 times a, which is 1, times c, which is 1, all divided by 2 times 1. Let me just move this over a bit. If I simplify this, I get x equals 2 plus or minus the square root of 4 minus 4, all divided by 2. And I get x equals 2 plus or minus the square root of 0 divided by 2. In this case, I can't do anything different, or if I do the square root of 0, I still get 0. So what I have to do now is I have to basically just simplify it. I get x equals 2 plus or minus 0 divided by 2. So in this case, regardless of what I do, if I add 0 or subtract 0, I'm still going to get the same answer in the end. So in this case, I only have to do this step once, and basically I'll get my final answer. Sorry, I'm just moving things around just to make it a little bit easier. And so if I simplify this, I just get 2 over 2, or equal to 1. So that means my x-intercept in this case is 1. So again, what we've done is, or we found the solutions, and the solutions of the quadratic equation or the quadratic formula are also the x-intercepts of the graph of the quadratic function, and they're also called the zeros or the roots. So again, the question may ask you to solve for the x-intercepts, or find them, or find the roots, or find the zeros. Well, again, to keep in mind, factoring sometimes works, so we can use factoring sometimes for this, but the quadratic formula will always work. So regardless of if you factor or not, the quadratic formula will always work. And finally, one last one. Solve and interpret the solutions for 3x squared equals 2x, or minus 2x equals 8. So again, I want to get this, or set it equal to 0, so I need to bring the 8 over. So 3x squared minus 2x minus 8 equals 0. I can find my a, b, and c value now, so these ones are in order. So I have a value, my b value, and my c value. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to plug this into the formula. So x equals negative b plus or minus b squared minus 4ac, all divided by 2a. So I have negative 2 plus or minus negative 2 squared minus 4 times 3 times negative 8, all divided by 2 times 3. If I simplify, x equals 2 plus or minus the square root, and all I'm doing is simplifying, so, or doing as many of the operations as I can. So negative 2 squared is 4, and minus negative 96, all divided by 6. I'm going to bring this up here. So when I simplify this even further, I have x equals 2 plus or minus the square root of 100 divided by 6, which I can simplify one step further if you want. 2 plus or minus 10 divided by 6. Now that I'm at this stage, there's only one thing left to do, which is to break it apart and then do my final solving. So I have x equals 2 plus 10 divided by 6, and x equals 2 minus 10 divided by 6. One side I get x is equal to 2, because 12 divided by 6 is 2, and I get x is equal to negative 1.3, because negative 8 divided by 6 is negative 1.3. So these are my two answers. So basically what I've asked is, what does 3x squared minus 2x minus 8, or when does that quadratic function, when does it equal 0? Or basically, where does it cross the x-axis? And we found that the roots of this, or where it crosses, are at 2, 0, and negative 1.3, 0. So if I were to graph that, I would graph those x-intercepts there. I can find one other point. I can find the y-intercept, because the y-intercept comes from my standard form. So my y-intercept is actually down here. I could find the vertex by going back and looking at the vertex form, or not the vertex form, sorry, by using these x-intercepts to find the middle value and then plugging it back in, which we've done before in a previous lesson. But I'm going to roughly just sketch it based on the 3 points that I have. So those are, or that's using the quadratic formula to find the x-intercepts. We've seen two scenarios, one where we get two answers, like this one at the bottom and the one at the first one we did, and we see an example where we have one solution, like this, the top one on the second page. There is a third option where you get a negative value in or under the square root, which means when you do that, you'll get an error. That's fine. That means there are no roots or no x-intercepts. Just make sure that it's not just a calculation error that's causing that, but when you've actually done it, you do get a negative value under there. And we'll take a look more at some of those examples in the next lesson.